All right, so we're continuing on with personality disorders. Last time we spoke, we were focusing on the cluster A personality disorders. So just to review, those were sort of the personality disorders where people were having a hard time getting along because they would engage in things that were sort of outside the norms, sort of unusual types of thinking, that sort of thing. We're going to move on today to the cluster B personality disorders, which are a little bit different. These are the ones that a lot of times can really get people into trouble, either in terms of how they interact with people. It can really affect relationships in kind of a negative way, and it can just be very difficult for people in terms of just helping them get along in the day-to-day. And it can affect them at work, it can affect them in terms of the legal system, it can affect them in a lot of different ways. So we're going to start off with the ones that are more focused on kind of like relationships, and then move more towards the ones that it can really cause people, more and more trouble in life in general, and sometimes really get them into some pretty serious trouble. So we're going to start off with histrionic personality disorder. So this one here is pretty interesting because when people have this condition, they tend to be very, very dramatic. So these are people that are really into excessive attention-getting behaviors. They can be very lively, dramatic, which in some ways can make them sort of the life of the party in some contexts. But what differentiates them from somebody who's just really, really gregarious is that they really crave that stimulation and attention, and will a lot of times take that attention seeking to the extreme. So sometimes you can see it on their appearance. They're going to be very theatrical in some ways. Can be very emotional, sometimes very sexually provocative in some ways. They may attempt to control their partners through seductive behaviors and emotional manipulation. So typically, they get into sort of these relationships they'll sort of be sort of enmeshed, and they can actually be drawn to people with other types of personality disorders, so that they have sort of these unusual relationships. So from the outside, if you can kind of, in some ways, if you don't know the full extent of the condition, you might just think it's somebody who's sort of self-centered or vain, excessively concerned about approval of other people. But these people tend to be very reactive, insincere in some ways. So as you can imagine, relationships with them would be pretty challenging in that way. We're going to jump on here to narcissistic personality disorder. So narcissistic, actually this one here, these can definitely be, we all know people who have narcissistic traits. If you look around, you can probably see within your own family. These conditions go beyond somebody who is just sort of big-headed, or just kind of thinks that they're the center of everything. Narcissistic personality disorder, there's really this sort of exaggerated sense of self-importance, a real preoccupation with being admired, and it can really lead to them being very self-centered in the sense that they can really lack empathy or feelings for other people. So, like I said, we all know people who are like this, and we're not just talking about somebody who maybe is sort of ambitious and is sort of focused on themselves. This really gets taken sort of to the extreme. With narcissistic personality disorder, there's sort of like the two subtypes of it. You have those that are really, really incredibly grandiose. And you can see this coupled with other conditions as well. And in that grandiosity, they sort of take it to the extreme and can almost have this aggression or dominance that they try to assert. They can have a real tendency to overestimate their own abilities and accomplishments and underestimate other people. So as you can imagine, when this person comes into the room, you might kind of see them as being sort of over the top into themselves in that way. But it's got to go to the extreme, to the point where it's going to really goof up their relationships with people around them. In the workplace, you're going to see this really goofing them up in terms of, I've experienced, individuals like this who have had trouble, and they've come to the mental health system because they're not being very successful in their work. And really what it comes down to is they're really overestimating their contribution and how great they are, and everybody else is kind of going, meh. So, and as you can imagine, people get pretty frustrated with them and pretty quickly just kind of want to stay away from them. I said there was two subtypes. So the first one was grandiose that I just described. The second one is vulnerable. So these individuals, tend to be very fragile and very unstable in their self-esteem. So, they sort of go between those extremes of almost coming across and acting like and believing themselves to be sort of up here and great, wonderful. And if something comes along that kind of challenges that, they can really just hit a real low, and that can be connected with a lot of problems with self-esteem, depression, things like that. And so you can kind of see it as like that arrogance and everything is sort of like it's like a shell, it's a facade that can be pretty easily broken. And then they can kind of vacillate between that and like a lot of shame and hypersensitivity to rejection and criticism. So for this reason, they may avoid interpersonal relationships because they feel slighted pretty regularly, or they feel like anything, they see it as a criticism in that way. So, and sometimes you see this vacillation between those two different types, where you have somebody who's very grandiose, and then they sort of become very fragile in that way. So it can be challenging in terms of being in a relationship with somebody like this, and they have a hard time establishing those relationships as well. So that was histrionic and narcissistic personality disorder. Stay tuned for some other videos that we're going to be doing on the other personality disorders, and we'll jump into those in the class here in a little bit.